Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome viewers to our program today. And today we have with us Professor Matthew Nelson, who is a reader in politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And his area of specialization is Islam in special reference to South Asia. Welcome, Professor Matthew Nelson, to our program today.
Thank you.
Right, we'll start with politics, and we know how unstable the political situation in the Muslim world is at the moment. How much do you think is the economic condition responsible for that?
I think there's incredible anxiety amongst Muslims about the economic situation in the world. Certainly, this anxiety is not exclusive to Muslims, but Muslims are by no means exempt from this anxiety. For instance, in Pakistan, I was just looking at a poll today in which people were asked about their most important concerns, and number one was inflation, number two was unemployment, and number three, distant third, was political instability, and so on. It's impossible to ignore the economic factor. You know, there are always people wondering whether the economic concerns and instability contribute to forms of political instability, or whether in fact the political instability creates uncertain economic conditions. But in every story, the economic circumstances are central.
Right, with all these riches and mineral wealth lying underground in the whole of the belt, especially the Emirates and especially the Middle East, why is it that the masses remain to be so poor and unprivileged?
Well, inevitably, access to resources and high levels of even economic growth are not redistributed in a way that will sort of provide those resources to everyone. In the case of the Middle East, where there is, as it were, a lot of wealth lying under the sand, the structure of the society is such that the distribution of those resources may extend to certain members of a particular local community. But if we look at the Emirates, many people living in the Emirates are not actually local to the Emirates. They're coming from India, they're coming from Bangladesh, they're coming from Pakistan, they're coming from Indonesia. And the inequalities in the redistribution are immediately apparent. You will see, for instance, lavish state subsidies for certain members of the community in the Emirates that entirely exclude, on the basis of ostensibly citizenship, huge portions of the population. And so even though in extremely affluent areas like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Sharjah, and so on, the wealth could lead to greater redistribution, it hasn't. And that is simply a factor of policy.
That's right. So when you look at it, how do you classify it? If we were to make a percentage, or to make maybe a ratio to see the rich to poor, how do you look at it? How do you think it is?
Oh, it's difficult to estimate. I don't have a figure at the tip of my finger, but I would say, the top, it's similar outside of the Muslim world, but the top 2 or 3% are holding 20, 40, 20, 30% of the resources. In the US today, even outside of the Muslim world, we're seeing trends in which tiny fractions of the population, less than 1%, is holding a percentage of the overall wealth far in excess of their numbers. This pattern is equally apparent in various parts of the Muslim world. Tiny fractions of the population increasingly owning more and more of the available resources. Yeah. Inequality is expanding.
Right. So economically speaking, if we were to make three major divisions, if we had, economically speaking, if we have the West, and if we have the Far East, and the third block to be the Muslim world, where do you think it stands economically?
On the issue of inequality, on the one hand, I'm inclined to say that inequality is quite apparent in the Muslim world, and I'm thinking particularly about South Asia, actually. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, huge and disturbing levels of inequality. But I can't actually say that the problem of inequality is necessarily more severe in the Muslim world than it is in some other parts of the world. I'm thinking of Africa, I'm thinking of even parts of the West. And China, of course, has growing levels of inequality. So the Muslim world certainly suffers from a problem that is common in other parts of the world. And one could say that the patterns of inequality are at least as entrenched in the Muslim world as they are elsewhere. I'm reminded of a program I once saw about the Hajj, where they interviewed someone from Europe, someone from South Africa, and someone from South Asia. And they had visions of equality. They would arrive in Mecca and they would find the equality that they did not notice in their own communities, because after all, it's the Hajj. And they arrive and only immediately discover that there are gradations of accommodation. There are gradations of sort of experience in the context of the Hajj itself. And this was disappointing. But it simply indicates that patterns of inequality are extremely difficult to move beyond and to correct.
Yep, that's right. As you know, Professor Nelson, that Zakat, I know that you are an expert on the Sharia and the Sharia law, especially your recent work I've seen is on the Sharia as well. You know that Zakat is taken to be the only monetary form of contribution to be taken from Muslims, and Islam is a proselytizing religion. It's a religion of proselytization and preaching. And there is a goal and an objective that the Muslims set for themselves, that the message of the book and the message of Allah to be spread across the globe. But looking at the economic condition of the Muslims in the Muslim world, how much do you think it's possible to do that through Zakat?
The potential that we see in Zakat is often greater than the experience of Zakat when it comes to redistributing resources. There is a great deal of hope in the possibility that Zakat could bring resources out of the Muslim community and distribute them to the needy in the community. But of course, Zakat only captures a very small fraction of the wealth. And the question arises whether that fraction is big enough to really address the millions who need some financial support. Even if it were, and of course I would say that it probably isn't sufficient, but even if it were, there will be controversies about how exactly the Zakat should be collected. Should it be collected automatically? Or should it be a voluntary process of going through the exercise of giving the money and therefore purifying its nature? There will be controversy about how it should be collected, and then further controversies about how it should be distributed. Should it be distributed amongst this part of the Muslim community or that part of the Muslim community? Different groups saying that actually their approach should prevail. It's very complicated. Many people will tell me, for instance, my students, we should pay attention to the pillars of Islam. Of course, they immediately refer to Zakat. Everyone will agree that Zakat is important. And it's possible that everyone will agree that Zakat is important. But that only raises further questions about how to bring it about in a way that's most appropriate and efficient and agreeable. And those are questions, not answers.
Yeah, absolutely, that's right. My last question I'd like to ask you, if you could shed some light for us and our viewers on, with the uprising of the Arab Spring and all that, how do you see, where do you think it's heading to, and any hope in the future? How do you look at it?
There's so much hope in the possibility or the potential rather, of the Arab Spring. But I think we have to be alert to some of the differences within the Arab world. As we speak, the trajectory followed by Tunisia looks different from the trajectory followed by Egypt. Tunisia, of course, appears to be consolidating some of the changes in the context of the Arab Spring. And Egypt is struggling with those transformations. And the Egyptians are in the process today of voting to decide what will happen next. And there is a very real possibility that the people of Egypt will come together around a clear articulation of their future. And even if they do, there's a possibility that it will be a bumpy road ahead, that some of the status quo interests won't be sympathetic to a rapid pace of change. I think that it will be a bumpy road for Egypt, even if the people of Egypt manage to find a common voice. Finding a common voice will be very difficult. Yeah. And the elections will show that. And I think that throughout the Arab Middle East, knowing that a common vision of the future is unlikely is a helpful realization. That one thing that the Arab Spring has allowed is a whole range of visions of the future. And negotiating those differences really will be the challenge. But there will be change. There already has been change. It's impossible to reverse some of that change, even if it is slowed. And I think change is what we're looking for.
Brilliant. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Matthew Nelson. It's been really wonderful to speak to you today. Thanks a lot.